So you heard the reading, and you're forgiven if you thought you had accidentally wandered into a wedding. The words of chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians are perhaps the most recited scripture passages at weddings, as well they should be. If there is a more beautiful Christian poem about love, I honestly don't know what it is. It's also one of those things that if you've tended to resent Paul, you get to 1 Corinthians, you go, okay, never mind. These words, of course, were not originally intended for a wedding. They were written for the church at Corinth, one that Paul had founded. He had been gone from Corinth for quite a while, and word had reached him that the church was, and I'm going to have to put this in technical terms, the church at Corinth was a hot mess. This church had an extremely wide range of socioeconomic statuses. There are a great many poor workers. They had originally been pagans, they had converted. But Paul had also had success in preaching at the Corinth synagogue, so that there were a number of devout Jews who had joined as well. And the church had also attracted some very, very wealthy pagan converts. However, Paul had received a number of complaints about church leadership. There was growing factionalism with people lining up behind the different preachers who had visited, as though this was, and he says something like this, as though this was the church of Paul or the church of Apollos or the church of Peter and not the church of Jesus Christ. And the worship services, oh my goodness, the church was charismatic in its practices, and it was also completely undisciplined about that. So numerous people claimed the gift of tongues, but it turns out they would all speak at the same time and raise a cacophony during worship, if you can imagine. Others claimed prophetic powers, but they were extremely competitive about it. And perhaps the greatest tell that something was seriously wrong was that when they met for the breaking of bread, the rich would bring their own food and wine and sit off in a corner and eat and drink and sometimes get drunk, but they would never share. The poor shared what little they had, but many of them went hungry at what was supposed to be a sacred meal. It was all too clear that many of the elite members of the church had no intention of living alongside the humble converts. Indeed, as often as not, they humiliated them, reminded them of their inferior status. And so throughout 1 Corinthians, Paul reminds these alleged leaders that their behavior was a fundamental betrayal of the Christian community. You know, Christians are to love and support and encourage one another, not compete with one another. And Paul reminds them that the leader who values and engages with the poor and the marginalized is actually the true Christian leader. So now you have the answer for the short essay question on the exam. What was the purpose of Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth? It was Paul's guidebook to what a truly Christian congregation looks like, and central to that was an appreciation of all the varying gifts that all the members could bring to the church. And the grounding of everything, the foundation of everything, is love. And hence, that magnificent treatise on love in chapter 13. Now, I suppose we could stop there. You know I won't, but we could. I honestly, though, think we need to look more closely at chapter 13. For starters, if you know what's going on in Corinth, the language of the first few verses just grabs you. Go ahead, Paul is saying. Speak with the tongue of angels. Exercise your prophetic powers. Know all the mysteries. But if you do any of that without love, you're simply making noise. Love has to be key. And then verse 7. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. What always gets me about that verse is that Paul takes the noun love and he turns it into a verb. Love is not what you feel. It's not a shiny object you put on a shelf. Love acts. Now, the problem with the English translation is that it doesn't quite do that sentence justice. In fact, I rather bemoan the poverty of the English language in regard to the idea of love. We have only one word for love. And having only one word creates the impression of equivalence when there actually isn't any. For example, I say, I love my spouse and my children and my grandchildren. And I also say that I love Ben & Jerry's Chunky Monkey banana ice cream. Now, both sentences are true, but the love conveyed in each is hardly the same. So as it turns out, and you probably already know this, the Greeks had a number of words for love. And those words conveyed different kinds of love. For example, if this had really been a treatise about married love, Paul probably would have used the word eros, which conveys a kind of love connected to physical expression. You might consider, since you're considering that Paul is trying to get this congregation to love each other, not in a physical way, we might have expected him to use philia, the love of friends. Philia is patient. Philia is kind. Philia is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. That seems to work. But that's not the word he uses. Instead, the word he uses for love is agape. It is agape that bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. In ancient Greek, the word agape meant a kind of global affection, a sense of charity towards the whole world. But the earliest Christians took the word and they infused it with something much more. It meant a love for all people, all creation, an unconditional love, a kind of love that was completely selfless, full of empathy, sacrificial, the kind of love that Jesus demonstrated, the kind of love that God has for us and for all of creation. It is a love that, unlike eros or philia, asks nothing in return. No expectation of emotional profit of any kind. There is no what's in it for me part to it. It's a very, very big kind of love. Now, I know that you've probably been exposed to the idea of agape before, and I wonder if, like me, you have trouble wrapping your head around it. I don't know about you, but when I'm told to love with the kind of love that God shows for us, honestly, I feel mostly overwhelmed. I mostly say, well, I'm not going to be good at that. I wonder if maybe we have to get at this agape love by starting really small. So I'm going to tell you a story. It's hard for me to tell because after almost 7 decades, I'm still quite ashamed about it, but here it goes. It was a hot summer afternoon in Kansas, which is a redundant sentence, and my family was at my grandfather's house, and I was outside playing with my cousin. Now, I was pretty excited because I was 7 and Billy was 11, and I was thrilled he would actually play with me because I thought he was so awesome. I mean, come on, he had stuff. He had his own hatchet, for heaven's sakes. Now, I don't quite remember how this happened, but at some point, Billy and I ended up with a piece of wood and a hammer and some nails, and we decided that we should make a grasshopper collection. Now, this was the pre-DDT era, so there were lots and lots of grasshoppers. And so it was easy. We would catch a grasshopper, and then I would hand Billy a nail, and then he would nail it to the board. Now, it wasn't exactly gory, but it was definitely, what's the word, gunky. I think we had 3 grasshoppers nailed, and I was going to get a turn with the hammer when we heard our grandpa's voice coming towards us, and he was shouting. He was really angry, and it was scary because he never was angry with us. "You stop that right now," he was shouting. And then he was standing over us, and he was still kind of shouting, "What do you think you are doing?" And Billy, because he was Billy, got a bit cheeky, and he said, "Come on, Pa, they're just grasshoppers." And then Pa got really angry. They are not just grasshoppers. They are one of God's creatures. And you will never, do you hear me, never be cruel to one of God's creatures. God's creatures are to be respected. And then he confiscated the hammer and the nails, and that was the end of it. Pa never said another word about it. I don't even think he told our parents. But the moment made a big impression on both Billy and me. We've talked about it since. And thankfully, it ended our careers as thoughtless abusers. Mercifully, they were brief careers. So why am I telling you this story? Now, my grandfather would not have put it this way, but I think he was trying to teach us about agape. We say that agape is the kind of love that God has for us in all creation, and that to practice agape ourselves, we need to see this planet we live on in the way that God sees it, and we need to be willing to love it as God does. And so to refuse to respect the life of a small creature is quite simply to refuse to respect life itself. And if we see life as God sees it, it becomes unthinkable to abuse any of God's creatures, any living thing. Living things require our unconditional love. From the reports that we have about that church in Corinth, we know that the elite of the community treated the poor among them as well. They treated them like Billy and I treated grasshoppers, unworthy of their attention, of their care, of their respect, certainly not their love. And Paul's treatise on love was to tell them that they had it all wrong. The church could not rest on accomplishments or money or power. Love, only agape was the foundation on which the church had to rest. Period. The end. No tagbacks ever. That message surely resonates today as much as it did 2,000 years ago. At least I hope it does. We live in a time in which it seems that new groups are constantly being picked to serve as this moment's grasshoppers. People who don't count. People beyond the pale of our protection. Immigrants, transgender people, and now women of childbearing age. We are daily witnesses to policies in which, frankly, the cruelty is the point. Much of the life on this planet because it interferes with our demand for profits. I know, so much of this seems way beyond our control. We know we should see the world as God sees it, but so much of what we think about the world is just filtered through our own needs, our own desires, our own fears, our own inclination to just look out for ourselves. So when we are overwhelmed by the world around us, the best medicine might just be to do some practice at agape. Perhaps we just begin by looking around us and finding one little thing at a time and try to look at it as God would. And when we do that, I think what happens is that we decenter ourselves. If we're lucky, We can even find a little child to lead us, because little children are very good at this, except Billy and me. Last summer, I was outside with my grandson, and at some point he called out that I needed to come and see something. That something turned out to be, of all things, you guessed it, a grasshopper. And I'm a little triggered by that. And I'm thinking, oh, please, please don't kill it. But that was the farthest thing from his mind. What Graham was doing was simply following the grasshopper, hop to hop. And when it stopped, he admired the grasshopper's back legs, how long they are, how they seem to have knees. And so we followed the hops, and then the grasshopper unfurled its wings, the ones you forget it has, and it took flight. And I think we both said, wow. I think God sees that flight too. And I think God says, wow. I think that God simply sees this little creature, one with whom we share the planet, and God just delights in it, like he delights in all creatures, like he delights in us. And maybe, just maybe, if we practice enough, we can see all of life that way, God's way. And so let it be our prayer that we learn to live our lives with faith and with hope and with this kind of love, with agape. May it be so. Amen.